society sees only the gown, never the heart beneath it. The grand doors of Ashford House opened with a measured grandeur, admitting a flurry of silk, velvet, and taffeta into the candlelit ballroom. The air shimmered with the heat of countless bodies, the delicate fragrance of orange blossoms, and the faint trace of polished wood. Outside, a light snow whispered against the darkened windows, the cold a quiet contrast to the fervor within. In that world of gilded splendor and mirrored walls, every movement, every glance carried judgment. She entered quietly, her gown modest and pale, the faintest blue against a sea of crimson, emerald, and gold. Her presence was almost a whisper, and yet, the eyes of the assembly swept over her with a practiced indifference reserved for those whom society deemed unworthy. A titter here, a suppressed laugh there, small daggers that pierced without sound. The ball had begun, yet in that moment she felt herself outside it, an observer of a game whose rules were written by those who valued only display. A lady of substantial means, whose gown rivaled the sheen of candlelight itself, cast a sharp glance in her direction and murmured something, just enough for nearby listeners to catch. "Plain, isn't she? How curious she dares appear among such elegance." Heads nodded in agreement, smiles polite yet edged with the cruel precision of scrutiny. The heroine's hands, gloved in pale linen, tightened slightly at her sides. Pride warred with the familiar ache of shame, and she drew in a breath, steadying herself against the weight of gazes that measured her worth in nothing but appearance. Across the room, leaning against the edge of the grand staircase with a composure cultivated over years of society observation, the Duke of Linton watched. His eyes, sharp and discerning, moved beyond the predictable displays of wealth and fashion. He saw her, not as others did, but as a study in quiet dignity. The faint lift of her chin, the calm acceptance of her exclusion, spoke to him of something far rarer than silk or jewelry: authenticity. There was a tension in the air, subtle but electric, a prelude to upheaval that no one in that glittering ballroom could yet sense. A sudden misstep drew attention. Her slipper caught the hem of her gown, a brief stumble that might have been forgiven had it been unnoticed. Instead, it drew a gasp and a few stifled chuckles. The orchestra's violins surged, and she regained her balance, cheeks tinged with a flush she fought to conceal. The world did not pause for her composure. Society's scrutiny moved relentlessly, indifferent to her grace. Yet the Duke's gaze lingered, an anchor of recognition in a storm of dismissal. A tray of champagne flutes passed near her, and a careless hand brushed against her arm, spilling a single drop that traced a trembling line along her glove. Heads turned. Whispers swelled like a tide. "Clumsy, unaware, how out of place," someone muttered, and the word struck sharper than any physical blow. She inhaled, holding herself erect, a model of restraint despite the heat of humiliation creeping up her spine. This was the battlefield of refinement, where dignity was both shield and sword, and she wielded it cautiously, aware that every misstep could be weaponized against her. And yet, amid the harsh light of scrutiny, there was a spark. Across the room, the Duke shifted slightly, allowing the glow of a nearby candelabra to illuminate his profile. A quiet acknowledgement, a tilt of the head, the faintest smile, a look that carried no judgment, only interest. That single gesture, so subtle that most would have missed it, ignited a flicker of hope. Perhaps not all eyes were blind to the substance that lay beneath the silk and modesty. Perhaps courage and spirit still had their place, even in a world that demanded perfection. She moved toward the edge of the ballroom, seeking both observation and refuge. Her heart beat not with fear alone but with a cautious curiosity. The Duke's attention was a mystery she could not yet decipher, yet it stirred something dormant, an ember of anticipation. The music swelled, the dancers twirled, and society continued its relentless parade, but in that space between judgment and recognition, the first threads of an unlikely story began to weave themselves. Humiliation had opened the door, but it had also drawn a witness whose interest promised to bend the rigid rules of propriety. The evening stretched ahead, full of expectation, poised on the knife edge between scandal and revelation. She felt the weight of every gaze, the sting of every whisper, and yet she dared to breathe more freely than she had dared in years. The ball was far from over, but already the first move had been made, and the game was no longer entirely against her. A single gift can speak the words society forbids. By the following week, whispers of the Ashford House ball still lingered in the drawing rooms and parlors of London, like lingering perfume upon a gown. Yet, amidst the gossip and polite conjecture, a curious change began to ripple through the quiet life of the heroine. She found, on the morning of the week's first engagement, a small parcel left upon her dressing table. Its wrapping was simple, tied with a ribbon of softest silver. No note accompanied it, save for a sprig of violet tucked delicately inside. She touched the fragile blooms with gloved fingers, startled by the thought that someone had dared notice her beyond mere appearance. The gesture, silent and intimate, struck her with the force of both wonder and caution. Society, she knew, would not forgive such attention lightly, and yet the act itself spoke to a truth she had rarely encountered, that someone could see the heart beneath the modest gown. It was her first token, a herald of intrigue, and it made her pulse quicken in ways she scarcely understood. No one claimed responsibility. Not a word from servants, nor a whisper from acquaintances, only the certainty that someone had taken care to breach the rigid walls of propriety for her alone. In the garden, she traced her fingers along the petals, inhaling their faint perfume, and imagined the hand that had chosen them with thoughtfulness rather than pomp. A rush of warmth climbed to her cheeks, a warmth not of vanity but of being quietly acknowledged. Yet the world outside remained unkind. At Lady Renford's afternoon reception, eyes that had ignored her at the ball now settled with curiosity tinged with suspicion. One particularly sharp-tongued matron leaned toward her companion and murmured, "I hear the Duke has taken an unusual interest in the unassuming Miss Arden. How improper." The words, meant to sting, fell upon her with a peculiar duality of humiliation and thrill. The very notion that the Duke of Linton, a man whose presence commanded admiration across every drawing-room in London, might take notice of her, unsettled and exhilarated her in equal measure. Days passed, and the tokens continued. A book of poetry left at her chair during a quiet tea, a ribbon of blue silk placed over her writing desk, a handwritten note slipped between pages of a ledger, speaking in phrases so subtle that only the careful heart would recognize their meaning. Each small gesture seemed a deliberate defiance of the rigid expectations of society, and with each she felt the stirrings of connection that had previously been denied to her. Yet society, as it ever does, is swift to twist admiration into scandal. Rumors began to swirl, faint at first, then more boldly. Some claimed she had bewitched the Duke with her wit, others whispered that she had orchestrated the gifts herself. Eyes followed her at gatherings with new scrutiny. The carriage of her neck, the careful manners of her hands, the very cadence of her speech were dissected and debated. She bore the scrutiny with a quiet dignity, though the tension pressed upon her chest as if the walls of every drawing-room conspired to collapse inward. It was in the shadowed corner of an evening promenade that the Duke appeared once more, his presence deliberate and unmistakable. He offered no words at first, only the faintest inclination of his head and a hand extended to retrieve a violet she had dropped into the snow. The gesture, small yet profound, sent a tremor through her composure. Here, in the hush of falling snow and muted gaslight, she felt the weight of the world's expectations, and yet, simultaneously, the possibility of a private rebellion against them. In that moment, the heroine understood that the tokens were not merely gifts, they were invitations. Invitations to courage, to risk, to see herself as the Duke might see her, unbound by gossip or judgment. And though the world continued its relentless scrutiny, the faint spark of scandal had begun to carry with it the thrill of possibility, that dignity, admiration, and perhaps even love could be won in the quietest of ways. By the evening's end, as she returned to her chamber, a letter awaited her, folded with precise care. The Duke's handwriting, fluid and assured, read not with arrogance but with earnest recognition. "Your spirit, Miss Arden, is as remarkable as the rarest of violets. Allow me the honor of proving it beyond whispered conjecture." The world outside would call it audacious, improper, scandalous, but within those words she discovered the first embers of hope, and the first challenge to the rigid order that had so long governed her life. Society might watch, judge, and whisper, but for the first time, the heroine felt herself poised not merely to endure, but to respond, to accept the tokens not as scandal but as an opening to something far more extraordinary. The game had shifted, and the quiet rebellion of heart and spirit had begun. If words could capture the heart's secret, I would speak them, though trembling. The library at Ashford House was a sanctuary from the scrutiny of society, a haven of polished oak shelves and quiet shadows. Here, the heroine found herself once more, guided by the Duke of Linton through corridors dimly lit by flickering candles. The murmur of the household faded behind them, replaced by the gentle crackle of a hearth, its flames casting dancing patterns across the walls. Every step she took was measured, yet her pulse betrayed her with a soft, insistent thrum, as if announcing to the world her awareness of what was to come. The Duke gestured to a high-backed chair near the fire, yet she remained standing, hesitant, her gloved hands clasped before her. "I hope," he began, his voice low and earnest, that you will forgive my presumption in seeking this meeting. I find, Miss Arden, that society's judgment cannot contain the thoughts which compel me to speak freely." Her breath caught. The candescent warmth illuminated his expression, one of both restraint and intensity, a combination that stirred a mixture of fear and hope within her. She dared a small nod, allowing him the unspoken permission to continue, though every fiber of propriety screamed caution. "You possess," he continued, stepping closer so that the faint scent of cedarwood and smoke mingled with the softness of his voice, "a composure and fortitude that no gown or jewel could grant. I have watched, quietly, as the world measures you by trivialities while you bear yourself with dignity that eclipses their judgment. And I confess," his voice faltered for the briefest instant, revealing a vulnerability seldom permitted in men of his stature, "I find myself compelled to know you wholly beyond the bounds of society's expectations." The heroine felt a warmth spread through her chest, equal parts exhilaration and terror. To hear such admiration spoken aloud was a sensation she had scarcely allowed herself to imagine. Yet the weight of propriety pressed upon her still. A life of careful observation had trained her to value caution, and she feared that to respond too freely would invite ruin. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling with the honesty of one unaccustomed to such proximity of truth, "I am grateful for your words, though I fear I am unworthy of their depth. Society has taught me to measure worth by fashion, fortune, and favor. I fear I cannot answer your interest without faltering in the eyes of the world." He shook his head gently, eyes softening as he lowered himself to a seat opposite her. "The world may look but it does not see. You must permit yourself the liberty to be recognized as you are, not as they decree. I do not seek to elevate you by their standards, Miss Arden. I seek only to know the quiet, steadfast courage that resides in you." Her breath came in shallow intervals, the flame light flickering across the faint pink that had risen to her cheeks. Words she had long concealed, of longing, of fear, of the small, aching hope that someone might see her beyond appearances, tumbled from her lips. She spoke of evenings spent in shadowed reflection, of the solitude imposed by polite society, of the yearning for recognition that transcended finery and gossip. The Duke listened with unwavering attention, every movement measured, every gesture deliberate. When she faltered, uncertain whether to continue, he extended his hand, just a touch upon the edge of hers, a silent offering of reassurance. It was neither possession nor demand, only acknowledgement, and it shattered the fragile barriers she had so carefully erected. Outside, a snowflake tapped against the window pane, small and delicate, and the world felt distant, as if it had paused to witness their exchange. In that quiet, shadowed library, the rules of society, of decorum, and of expectation were suspended, replaced by a more potent force: understanding, connection, and the daring intimacy of shared truth. Yet even as her confession breathed life into a new possibility, a tension lingered. Somewhere beyond the hearth's warmth, a rival eye might glimpse, a servant might overhear, a whisper might spread. The heroine was acutely aware that this stolen moment existed in a fragile space between scandal and secrecy, and she felt the exquisite thrill of danger that accompanies the first true revelation of heart. The Duke rose, his gaze never leaving hers, and spoke softly, yet with an authority that left no room for doubt. "Miss Arden, fear not the judgment of the world when it conflicts with the knowledge of your own worth. Permit me to see you as you wish to be seen, not as society demands, and I shall honor that above all." And in the warmth of the flickering fire, with the snow falling silently beyond the glass, the heroine understood that a path had been opened, one that led away from shame and toward the uncharted terrain of possibility, trust, and love. The risk was immense, yet the promise shimmered brighter than any jewel she had ever glimpsed, and her heart, long restrained, dared at last to respond. "I will break every rule, not for society but for you." The grand ballroom of Ashford House shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their brilliance mirrored in polished floors and gilded panels. Music flowed in a lilting cascade, a waltz that carried the whispers and gasps of the ton as they swirled about the room. The heroine, poised yet aware of every scrutinizing eye, moved through the crowd with the quiet dignity that had always set her apart. Her gown, though modest, seemed to glow in the candelabra light, its pale fabric catching the shimmer of gold and firelight. Every step was measured, deliberate, every breath carried both apprehension and resolve. And then he appeared. The Duke of Linton, tall, commanding, yet approachable in his ease, advanced through the throng with the certainty of one accustomed to both admiration and authority. Eyes followed him, curiosity rippling through the assembly, but his gaze remained unwaveringly fixed upon her. He paused before her, the space between them charged with an electricity neither of them had felt before, and bowed with a gravity that silenced the murmurs around them. "Miss Arden," he said, his voice resonant, carrying above the faint rustle of silk and polite laughter. "The time has come to disregard the petty judgments of those who cannot see what is worthy, and to acknowledge what is true." A murmur ran through the crowd. The ton leaned in, drawn by his authority and the implication of impropriety. Some eyes widened in shock, others in admiration, but the heroine held her ground, heart racing yet unyielding. He extended his hand, not in the mere formal gesture of the polite dance, but as an invitation, a declaration. "May I have this dance, not as the Duke demands, but as one who sees the courage, the intellect, and the spirit that have been ignored for far too long?" Gasps punctuated the room. The audacity of his words reverberated like a struck bell. Ladies whispered behind fans, gentlemen straightened in surprise, and yet she saw not the scandal but the truth in his eyes. She placed her hand in his, the warmth of his palm grounding her, a silent pact that they would step together into defiance of convention. The music swelled, and they moved across the floor with a grace born not of practice alone, but of understanding and trust. Every glance they exchanged carried a universe of unspoken meaning, every subtle touch a testament to connection forged in quiet defiance of societal expectation. In that instant, the ballroom ceased to exist as a theater of judgment. It became a stage for courage, for acknowledgement, for truth. And yet, the tension was far from dissipated. The whispers grew, sharpened with envy and speculation. A rival, whose interest had been piqued and whose pride stung, approached with thinly veiled ire, yet the Duke's presence alone commanded restraint. He spoke, softly yet deliberately, so that all could hear, "No scrutiny, no gossip, nor tradition shall dictate whom I choose to honor. Let this be clear, what is right in the eyes of the heart outweighs the judgment of the multitude." The heroine's chest rose and fell with relief and exhilaration. Shame that had haunted her like a shadow was replaced with affirmation. Her dignity restored in the most public of manners, yet rendered intimate by the focus of his attention alone. She felt the rush of triumph, not of vanity but of being truly seen, understood, and valued. The waltz carried on, the Duke guiding her with steady hands, eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time, the heroine realized that scandal could be transformed into celebration, that courage could render even the most rigid society pliable in the face of authenticity. The world around them remained expectant, curious, and judgmental, yet in that orbit of quiet defiance, they created a space where propriety bent to honor what was genuine. As the dance drew to its close, the Duke inclined his head, voice hushed but firm. "This is only the beginning, Miss Arden. I shall not falter in my regard, nor shall I allow the whispers of others to define what is ours to claim." And she, heart alight with a mixture of relief, anticipation, and courage, allowed herself a single radiant smile, the first unguarded acknowledgment of joy that had been denied her for so long. The declaration was made, the resolution taken, not through force or fortune but through recognition, bravery, and the unyielding power of truth. The ballroom's music swelled once more, the whispers softened into murmurs of awe, and amidst the glittering chandeliers and rustling silks, two hearts stood united in defiance of convention, poised at the threshold of a life no longer dictated by society, but by love and the courage to embrace it fully. The heart's courage outshines even the grandest gown. The days that followed the Ashford House ball were cloaked in a quiet intensity, as though the city itself held its breath, waiting to witness the ripples of a bold defiance that had been set into motion. The heroine walked through the streets with a new awareness, the glances of society brushing past her no longer piercing with disdain, but shifting with curiosity and tentative respect. Each step, measured and purposeful, carried the weight of triumph born not of wealth or beauty, but of steadfast courage and dignity reclaimed. The Duke of Linton remained at her side, though never in ostentation, always with that subtle, deliberate attentiveness that had drawn her heart into quiet surrender. Their interactions were no longer whispered meetings in shadowed corridors or brief encounters across candlelit ballrooms. Each glance, each gesture, spoke openly of mutual respect and affection, yet retained the delicate elegance demanded by the world around them. Theirs was a connection forged in defiance of rumor, nurtured in secrecy, and now illuminated with the gentle glow of affirmation. A carriage drew up one frost-tipped morning, its polished panels gleaming beneath the pale winter sun. Inside, the Duke waited, a single violet pinned to his coat as if to remind her of the first spark of recognition that had ignited in the quiet of a cold, snowed-in evening. She entered with a mixture of grace and exhilaration, and he extended his hand, the familiar warmth grounding her. "Shall we step beyond the confines of expectation, Miss Arden?" he asked, his voice a quiet promise that carried more weight than any proclamation of society. Their journey led through frost-silvered avenues, past whispered observers who dared to marvel, and into the shelter of a secluded garden, where snowflakes drifted silently like tiny confessions from the sky. There the world's judgment held no dominion. The heroine felt the full measure of her liberation. No longer bound by whispered ridicule or the petty decrees of fashion, she stood as herself, fully recognized and fully cherished. The Duke turned, eyes steady, unwavering. "You have endured the harshness of the world with a grace I have seldom witnessed. And now, I ask you not for compliance with my desires alone, but for the union of hearts that neither society nor circumstance can diminish." His words, deliberate and unflinching, carried the promise of constancy, courage, and respect, a legacy far greater than the fleeting admiration of a ballroom. Her lips curved in a small, radiant smile, tempered by tears that threatened only for the weight of years of restraint and longing. "I accept," she whispered, her voice steady, yet tremulous with the intensity of what she felt. "Not as a concession to society, nor as a surrender, but as a joining of hearts that honors truth above all else." The garden seemed to hold its breath, the snow suspended in silent applause, and in that moment, they were neither constrained by expectation nor diminished by doubt. Hands entwined, they stepped forward together, a testament to the power of courage, of honesty, and of unwavering recognition. The world around them may have shifted with slow, grudging acknowledgement, yet it was the private victories, the reclamation of dignity, the fearless assertion of worth, that defined their triumph. And so, the heroine's legacy was not written in silk or in gossiped rumor, but in the quiet resilience she had nurtured, in the courage to be seen and loved as she truly was. The Duke's admiration was steadfast, a reflection not of societal favor, but of unwavering respect and devotion. They moved forward together, their story a beacon to all who had ever been dismissed or diminished, proof that the heart's integrity outshines the judgment of 1,000 eyes. In the soft glow of lamplight and snow, amid whispers of admiration that had grown into reluctant awe, the world recognized what had always been true: courage, authenticity, and the unyielding pursuit of love would endure, long after gowns faded and chandeliers dimmed. And within that truth, both the Duke and the heroine found a permanence more radiant than any society's fleeting approval, a legacy etched not in scandal, but in the timeless courage of the heart.